The rain fell relentlessly over New York City, turning streets into slick mirrors reflecting the glow of neon signs and flickering traffic lights. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and pedestrians, shielded by colorful umbrellas, moved briskly along the sidewalks. The hum of the city seemed muted, dampened by the steady downpour. Among the hustle and bustle, hidden from the chaos, stood a small, warm haven, a cozy 24-hour diner with foggy windows and the aroma of fresh coffee wafting into the rainy night. Inside, the diner was a pocket of warmth, where the sounds of clinking dishes and the low murmur of conversations created a soothing backdrop. Tired office workers nursed cups of steaming coffee. Night shift cab drivers sat hunched over bowls of chili, and a few late-night stragglers stared blankly at their plates as the city's life continued outside. Seated in a corner booth near the window was a figure few people noticed. A man dressed simply in a dark hoodie and jeans, his damp hair pushed back from the rain. Keanu Reeves. To most people, he would have been unrecognizable at first glance. But this wasn't a man seeking attention or special treatment. He was simply another soul seeking comfort from the storm outside. Keanu enjoyed places like this, where life felt real and unfiltered, where people weren't wearing masks of perfection. He often found himself drawn to the simplicity of moments like these, where no one cared who you were or what you had. Tonight, though, he wasn't thinking about himself. His gaze was fixed on a woman sitting a few tables away, her head bent low as she carefully tore small pieces of bread and handed them to her young son. The boy, no older than 4, eagerly accepted the bread, but it was clear he wanted more. His eyes kept darting toward the plate of half-eaten fries and the small bowl of soup in front of them. The woman whispered something to him, her expression soft but tired, as if she was holding back tears. Keanu observed quietly, his mind racing as he pieced together the scene. The woman's clothes were clean but worn, her coat visibly too thin to protect her from the harsh weather outside. She occasionally glanced toward the front counter, where the diner's cashier stood, as though calculating something in her head, whether she could afford more food or if she'd have to stretch what they had. Her hands trembled slightly as she sipped her coffee, trying to warm herself. Keanu had seen this look before. It was a look of quiet desperation, of someone barely holding it together but determined not to break in front of her child. He knew he had to do something, but how could he help without making her feel embarrassed or pitted? He didn't want to draw attention to her or himself. Reaching into the pocket of his hoodie, he pulled out his wallet and examined its contents. There was enough cash to cover their meal and plenty left over for whatever else they might need. But this wasn't just about paying for food. It was about offering a small moment of relief, a reminder that people cared. Keanu had learned throughout his life that sometimes the smallest gestures left the biggest impact. He waited for the right moment. The woman shifted in her seat, checking her phone briefly before helping her son wipe ketchup from his face. As she leaned over the table, Keanu stood up quietly, taking care not to draw attention to himself. He approached the cashier, his hood still covering most of his face, and spoke in a low voice. "Can you do me a favor?" He asked the cashier, a young man with earbuds in and a bored expression on his face. The cashier pulled out one earbud and raised an eyebrow. "What do you need?" Keanu gestured subtly toward the woman and her child. "I want to cover their bill. Everything they order tonight and anything they take to go. And if you can bring them something extra, a hot chocolate or dessert for the kid. Don't tell them who paid. Just say it's taken care of." The cashier hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the booth before nodding. "Got it. You sure you don't want them to know?" "I'm sure," Keanu replied. "Let them enjoy their meal without feeling awkward." With that, he slipped the cash onto the counter, enough to cover the food and a generous tip, and returned to his seat. But instead of resuming his meal, he watched as the magic of a small act of kindness unfolded. The waitress approached the woman's table with a warm smile and placed a fresh plate of fries and a slice of chocolate cake in front of them. "This is for you," the waitress said cheerfully. "No charge tonight. Someone's covering your meal." The woman's eyes widened in surprise. She opened her mouth to protest, but was quickly silenced by the sight of her son's face lighting up at the sight of the cake. His little hands clapped together excitedly, and for the first time that evening, he giggled. a sound so pure that it seemed to lift the weight from his mother's shoulders. "But who?" the woman began, but the waitress shook her head gently. "Just someone who wanted to help," she said with a wink before walking away. Keanu watched as the woman's shoulders relaxed, as if the burden she carried had been momentarily lifted. She wiped her eyes quickly, pretending to adjust her son's jacket, but Keanu could see the emotion she was holding back. Moments later, she took a deep breath and smiled, a genuine, grateful smile that spoke volumes. In that moment, Keanu knew he had done the right thing. Sometimes, it wasn't about grand gestures or public recognition. Sometimes, it was about showing someone that they weren't alone, that even strangers could care enough to help without asking for anything in return. The boy took a large bite of the chocolate cake, giggling as the frosting smudged across his face. His mother laughed softly, reaching over to wipe it away, her laughter blending with the background noise of the diner. Keanu leaned back in his seat, sipping his coffee as he gazed out the foggy window into the rain-soaked night. The city outside remained as chaotic as ever, but inside this small diner, a quiet moment of joy had been created, one that, for Keanu, felt more meaningful than any applause or red carpet appearance. He would leave soon, disappearing into the night like he always did, but this moment would stay with him. And he knew it would stay with him too. The smell of freshly baked fries and rich chocolate lingered in the air as Keanu sat quietly in his booth, observing the scene before him. The young boy giggled uncontrollably as he dug into the dessert, his small fingers covered in frosting. His mother, despite her tired appearance, was laughing with him, a sound that carried warmth and relief, as though the storm outside no longer mattered. She hadn't looked around the diner to see if she could identify the mysterious benefactor, nor had she tried to ask the waitress again. Perhaps she understood that some acts of kindness were meant to be anonymous, or maybe she was simply too exhausted to pursue answers. Either way, she seemed content. For the first time in a long while, the weight she carried appeared lighter. Keanu finished his coffee, letting the warmth seep into him as he reflected on what he had just witnessed. It wasn't the first time he had seen someone struggling, nor would it be the last. But something about this woman's quiet determination to shield her son from their hardships had struck a chord deep within him. He knew what it was like to fight silent battles, to put on a brave face when the world felt like it was closing in. His thoughts wandered back to his own past, the losses, the grief, the nights when he had felt completely alone. Those memories weren't ones he often shared with the public, but they had shaped him, given him a deeper understanding of human suffering. And it was that understanding that drove him to act, to help whenever he could, even if it was something as small as paying for a meal. The rain outside had intensified, pounding against the windows with a ferocity that matched the city's restless spirit. Keanu glanced at his watch. It was getting late, but something kept him rooted to his seat. He didn't want to leave just yet. There was a part of him that wanted to see how this night would end for the woman and her son. As if on cue, the boy finished his last bite of cake and let out a content sigh, leaning back against the booth. His mother chuckled softly and wiped his sticky hands with a napkin before checking her phone again. Keanu noticed the slight furrow in her brow, the way her fingers hesitated as she scrolled through her screen. Was she checking her bank balance? Looking for a bus schedule? He couldn't be sure, but the brief moment of concern on her face hinted at the struggle she would return to once they left the warmth of the diner. The waitress returned with 2 paper bags filled with food, a surprise takeout order that Keanu had requested earlier. She placed the bags on the table and smiled warmly at the woman. "Some extra for the road," she said. "You never know when you'll need it." The woman's eyes glistened as she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know who did this, but thank you." The waitress patted her shoulder gently before heading back to the kitchen, leaving the woman to gather her things. Keanu watched as she carefully packed up her belongings, making sure her son was bundled up in his jacket and scarf. She double-checked the contents of the takeout bags, her fingers lingering on them for a moment as if she couldn't believe this was real. Then, with a deep breath, she stood up and guided her son toward the door. As they passed Keanu's booth, the little boy suddenly stopped. He looked up at Keanu, his curious eyes locking onto the man who had been sitting quietly in the corner. There was an unspoken connection in that brief moment, a child's innocent intuition sensing something that the adults around him couldn't. "Mommy," the boy said, tugging on her hand. "That man looks like—" The woman gently hushed him, smiling apologetically at Keanu. "Sorry," she murmured, pulling her son along. But before they could take another step, Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but clear. "Take care of each other," he said, his words carrying the weight of someone who understood the importance of that simple advice. The woman paused, her eyes meeting his for the first time. There was a flicker of recognition, maybe not of his celebrity status, but of something deeper. Compassion, understanding, a shared experience of life's challenges. She nodded, her lips curving into a small, grateful smile. "We will," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, with her son's hand firmly in hers, she pushed open the diner's door and stepped into the rain. Keanu watched them go, their silhouettes disappearing into the night as the rain swallowed the sound of their footsteps. His heart felt full, yet there was a lingering ache, a reminder that no matter how much kindness one could offer, the world was still filled with people facing battles no one else could see. The waitress returned to clear his table, giving him a knowing look. "You're a good man," she said softly, collecting the empty coffee cup and plate. Keanu smiled faintly and shook his head. "Just trying to be." As he stood up and put on his coat, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. He knew that he couldn't solve every problem or help every person in need. But tonight, he had made a difference for one family, and that was enough. Before leaving the diner, he slipped a few extra bills onto the counter, enough to cover another meal for the next person who might need it. Then, with his hood pulled up to shield him from the rain, he stepped outside and let the city's energy envelop him once more. The streets were quieter now, with only the occasional car splashing through puddles and the distant sound of a subway rumbling beneath the ground. Keanu walked without a specific destination, his mind replaying the events of the evening. He wondered if the woman would ever realize who had helped her, or if this night would simply become a cherished memory, one that reminded her of the kindness that still existed in the world. Either way, he was content. He had learned long ago that true acts of kindness didn't need recognition. They only needed to exist. As he turned the corner and disappeared into the misty glow of a streetlight, the rain continued to fall, washing away the day's burdens and cleansing the city for a new dawn. Somewhere out there, a mother and her son were heading home with full bellies and warm hearts. Proof that even in a city as vast and unforgiving as New York, small moments of compassion could create ripples of hope. The rain hadn't let up by the time Keanu reached the nearest subway station. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet concrete and the metallic tang of underground tunnels. His footsteps echoed softly as he descended the stairs, the sounds of the city fading into the background. The station was dimly lit, with only a few people waiting on the platform. Most of them huddled under the shelter of benches or leaning against tiled walls, scrolling through their phones. Water dripped steadily from the edges of the ceiling, forming small puddles along the tracks. Keanu pulled his hood lower, blending seamlessly into the crowd. In moments like these, anonymity was a gift, allowing him to observe the world without interruption. As he waited for the next train, his mind wandered back to the diner. He could still see the little boy's frosting-covered smile, the way his mother's eyes had softened when she realized someone had helped her. That moment of relief, brief as it may have been, was what Keanu had hoped for. He didn't need thanks or recognition, just the knowledge that, for one night, someone's burden had been eased. The familiar rumble of an approaching train shook the platform, and the distant lights of its headlights illuminated the tunnel ahead. Keanu stepped closer to the edge, his hands tucked into his pockets, as the train came to a stop with a whoosh of air. The doors slid open, and he stepped inside, finding an empty seat near the window. The train car was sparsely populated. An elderly man with a cane sat a few seats away, nodding off as the train rocked gently. A young couple sat across from Keanu, whispering and laughing softly, oblivious to the world around them. Further down the car, a man in a tattered coat and mismatched shoes rummaged through a plastic bag, his fingers trembling as he searched for something inside. Keanu recognized the man's struggle immediately. His clothes were damp and stained, his beard unkempt, and his eyes hollow with exhaustion. A faint smell of alcohol lingered in the air, mixing with the other scents of the subway. The man muttered to himself as he pulled out a half-eaten sandwich, unwrapped it, and took a small, hesitant bite. It wasn't the first time Keanu had encountered someone living on the streets. He had spent years in cities like New York and Los Angeles, where homelessness was a harsh and inescapable reality. But tonight, after what he had just witnessed in the diner, the sight of this man struck a deeper chord. Keanu glanced down at the bag he was carrying, a simple brown paper bag containing the leftovers from his meal at the diner. He hadn't planned on eating them, but he had taken them out of habit, not wanting the food to go to waste. Now he realized they had a purpose. He waited for the right moment. The train swayed gently as it sped through the tunnels, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks creating a soothing backdrop. The man finished his sandwich and stuffed the crumpled wrapper back into the plastic bag, sighing heavily as he leaned against the window. Keanu stood up, the paper bag in hand, and made his way down the car. The man didn't notice him at first, too lost in his own world to register the presence of someone approaching. But when Keanu stopped in front of him, the man's gaze slowly lifted, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Hey," Keanu said softly, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I've got some extra food. Thought you might want it." The man's eyes flicked to the bag, then back to Keanu's face. For a moment, he didn't say anything, as if he couldn't decide whether to accept the offer or reject it out of pride. Keanu didn't push. He simply stood there, waiting patiently. Finally, the man reached out, his fingers trembling as he took the bag. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice rough and hoarse. Keanu nodded and took a seat across from him, giving the man space to eat without feeling watched. The man hesitated for a moment before opening the bag and peering inside. The aroma of warm fries and a neatly wrapped sandwich filled the air, and for the first time that night, a faint smile tugged at the corners of the man's lips. He unwrapped the sandwich and took a bite, chewing slowly as though savoring each flavor. Keanu could see the change in his posture, the way his shoulders relaxed, the tension in his jaw easing. It wasn't just the food that mattered. It was the gesture itself. In a world that often looked past people like him, someone had seen him tonight. Someone had acknowledged his existence. As the man ate, Keanu leaned back in his seat, letting the gentle sway of the train lull him into a state of calm. He knew that this moment, like the one in the diner, wouldn't solve all the man's problems. Tomorrow, the man would still face the same struggles, the cold nights, the judgmental stares, the uncertainty of where his next meal would come from. But for now, he had warmth, comfort, and the knowledge that someone cared enough to help. The train slowed as it approached the next station, the screech of the brakes echoing through the car. Keanu glanced at the man one last time, watching as he carefully folded the paper bag and placed it beside him, as though saving the rest for later. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting moment, no words were needed. The gratitude in the man's gaze said everything. As the train came to a stop and the doors slid open, Keanu stood up and prepared to exit. But before he stepped off, the man's voice stopped him. "Hey," the man called out, his voice softer this time. "What's your name?" Keanu hesitated for a moment, then turned back with a gentle smile. "Just someone passing through," he said. The man nodded, as if he understood the answer perfectly. "Well, thanks, man. You didn't have to do this." Keanu nodded once more, then stepped off the train and onto the platform. The cold air of the station hit him immediately, but he didn't mind. As he ascended the stairs and emerged onto the rain-soaked streets, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. In a city as vast and indifferent as New York, it was easy to feel lost, to believe that small gestures didn't matter. But tonight, Keanu had seen the opposite. He had seen how a plate of food, a warm smile, or a simple act of kindness could change someone's night, maybe even their outlook on life. The rain continued to fall as Keanu walked down the street, his hood pulled low to shield him from the elements. He didn't know where the woman from the diner was or what the man on the subway would do next, but he hoped that tonight would stay with him the way it stayed with him. Because sometimes, in the chaos of life, it wasn't about changing the world all at once. It was about changing one moment at a time. Keanu walked through the rain-drenched streets of Manhattan, his boots splashing gently into puddles as he navigated the slick sidewalks. The glow of streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, casting soft halos of light that illuminated the city's midnight rhythm. Taxis zipped by, their tires cutting through the water with a quiet hiss, while the occasional pedestrian hurried past under the shelter of umbrellas. For most, it was just another rainy night in New York, but for Keanu, the weight of the evening lingered in his heart. The woman at the diner, the homeless man on the subway, they weren't just strangers he had encountered in passing. They were reminders of how fragile life could be, of how easily people could slip through the cracks of society if no one paid attention. Keanu had always been sensitive to that fragility, perhaps because of the losses he had endured in his own life. He understood how quickly circumstances could change, how a single event could turn someone's world upside down. He slowed his pace as he passed a small park, the sound of rain pattering softly against the leaves of the trees. The park was mostly empty, save for a lone figure sitting on a bench beneath a street lamp. An elderly man, bundled in a thick coat, clutched a cane in one hand and a small plastic bag in the other. He stared out at the empty playground, lost in thought as the rain soaked his shoes. Keanu hesitated, his instincts urging him to approach, but something held him back. Not every encounter required intervention, he reminded himself. Sometimes, people needed space to process their own thoughts without interference. Still, he couldn't help but wonder about the man's story. What had brought him to this bench on a rainy night, and what memories played through his mind as he sat there. As Keanu stood in contemplation, a soft voice from behind startled him. "Excuse me, sir." He turned to see a young woman, barely in her 20s, standing under a dripping umbrella. Her coat was soaked, and her cheeks were flushed from the cold. She clutched a small canvas bag against her chest, her expression a mixture of determination and nervousness. "Do you know if there's a shelter nearby?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "I'm not from here, and my phone died. I've been walking for hours." Keanu's heart ached at the sight of her. She looked exhausted, her eyes heavy with the kind of fatigue that went beyond physical tiredness. He could see that she had been through a lot, perhaps more than she was willing to admit to a stranger. "There's a shelter a few blocks from here," Keanu replied gently. "I can walk you there if you'd like." Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, she seemed unsure whether to trust him. But something in his demeanor must have reassured her, because she nodded hesitantly. "Thank you. I just need somewhere to rest for a bit." They walked side by side in silence, the sound of their footsteps blending with the rain. Keanu kept a respectful distance, sensing that the woman needed time to collect her thoughts. He didn't press her for details, didn't ask why she was out here or what had led her to seek a shelter. He knew that sometimes the best way to help was to simply be present. As they reached the shelter, a modest building with a glowing sign that read Community Haven, Keanu stopped and gestured toward the entrance. "They'll have a warm meal and a place for you to sleep," he said. "Just tell them you need assistance, and they'll help you." The woman looked at the building, then back at Keanu. Her eyes glistened, and she opened her mouth to speak but hesitated. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you. You didn't have to do this." Keanu smiled softly. "It's okay. We all need a little help sometimes." She nodded, her lips quivering as she tried to hold back tears. "I don't know how I ended up like this," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I had everything planned." And then, Keanu placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, stopping her mid-sentence. "You don't have to explain," he said kindly. "What matters is that you're here now, taking the steps to get through it." The woman wiped her eyes quickly and took a deep breath. "Thank you," she repeated, her voice stronger this time. With that, she turned and walked toward the shelter's entrance, disappearing inside as the rain continued to fall. Keanu stood there for a moment, watching the door close behind her. He knew that her journey wasn't over and that the road ahead would be difficult. But he also knew that tonight, she had found a small glimmer of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, kindness could light the way. As he walked away from the shelter, his thoughts returned to the question that had been on his mind all evening. Why was it so easy for people to ignore those in need? The city was filled with people, each wrapped up in their own lives, their own problems. But was it really that hard to pause, to notice the struggles of others and offer a helping hand? Keanu didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He would continue to notice. He would continue to help, even if it was just one person at a time. The rain began to ease as he made his way back toward his apartment, the city slowly winding down for the night. The glow of streetlights and the distant hum of traffic created a soothing atmosphere. And for the first time in hours, Keanu felt a sense of peace. Tonight had been filled with small moments of connection, brief but meaningful encounters that reminded him of the power of human empathy. The woman at the diner, the homeless man on the subway, the young woman at the shelter. They were all part of the same story, a story that Keanu had quietly woven himself into through simple acts of kindness. As he reached his building and stepped inside, the warmth of the lobby greeted him like an old friend. He took off his damp coat and shook off the rain before heading up to his apartment. The city outside continued its restless hum, but within Keanu's heart, there was a quiet satisfaction, a feeling that for tonight, he had made a difference. And that was all he needed.